The early morning haze lay low over the fields near Arracourt, France, like a thin curtain hiding what no one wanted to see. On September 19th, 1944, inside a Sherman tank, Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes adjusted his headset, while his fingers tapped nervously against the gun breech. Ahead of him, his gunner pressed his eye to the periscope and scanned the fog, knowing that danger could appear at any second. They had been warned. Panthers were nearby. To American tank crews in 1944, the German Panther was more than just a tank. It was a moving wall of steel. Its sloped armor had turned too many American shells into useless sparks, and too many Sherman crews had learned the same hard lesson. Do not fight a Panther from the front, or you will lose. What Hayes and his crew did not yet understand was that, deep inside their ammunition rack, sat a few unusual rounds, rare and tightly rationed, and only issued to certain Sherman crews equipped with 76mm guns. No one called them miracle weapons, and no one promised success. They carried only a quiet question, hanging in the air between oil smoke and hot steel. Could an American Sherman really threaten a Panther head-on? The answer was yes, and the key was tungsten. These were not the standard armor-piercing shells that had failed again and again. These were high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, known as HVAP, designed for the newer 76mm guns, and each round carried a small core of tungsten carbide, and each one held a core of tungsten carbide, one of the hardest materials known to man. When fired from a 76mm gun, the round left the barrel at extremely high speed, well over 1,000 meters per second, far faster than standard armor-piercing shells, moving like a steel drill driven by speed and force, fast enough and hard enough to penetrate vulnerable sections of the Panther's mantlet under the right conditions. The effect was not only physical, it was psychological. For months, German tank crews had fought with confidence, believing they were safe behind armor their enemies could not break. American crews, in contrast, had learned fear. They avoided frontal fights, hoped for air support, and waited for lucky shots from the side. The Panther shaped how they thought, how they fought, and how they survived. But that balance was about to change, the story of how a special type of ammunition changed the balance in certain moments of armored combat. It begins thousands of miles away in the United States, inside test ranges, factories, and laboratories, where engineers and metallurgists raced against time to solve a problem that threatened the lives of American tank crews and possibly the outcome of the war in Europe itself. In early 1944, the United States Army faced a crisis that military planners had badly underestimated. The M4 Sherman tank, the backbone of American armored divisions rolling across Europe, was running into German tanks it simply could not defeat from the front. Chief among these was the Panther, Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, a medium tank that combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with frontal armor that seemed nearly impenetrable. The numbers told a grim story. The Panther's glacis plate, the sloped front armor, measured 80mm thick, but it was angled at 55 degrees. Because the armor was sloped at 55 degrees, its effective resistance to incoming shells was much greater than its actual thickness, although this did not translate directly into a simple vertical equivalent, turning the front of the tank into a shield that the Sherman's standard 75mm M3 gun was generally unable to penetrate the Panther's sloped frontal armor under normal combat conditions, making frontal engagements highly ineffective and dangerous. Rounds would strike that sloped armor and simply ricochet away, leaving bright scars on the steel but doing no real damage. Meanwhile, in ideal conditions, the Panther's high-velocity gun was capable of destroying a Sherman at ranges beyond 2,000 meters, although most combat in Normandy occurred at much shorter distances, a distance at which American tankers couldn't even hope to fight back effectively. American intelligence had gotten it wrong. Planners had predicted that Panthers would be rare. that the Germans wouldn't be able to produce many of these advanced tanks. But by June 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, a staggering 38% of German tanks in the theatre were Panthers. Not a handful, not a few dozen, hundreds of them, crewed often by inexperienced soldiers, yes, but protected by armor that made experience almost irrelevant in a frontal duel. For the American tankers who had to face them, the Panther became a nightmare that haunted their sleeping hours and their waking ones. Crews began calling their Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter, claiming they lit up every time they were hit. While post-war analysis would show this reputation was somewhat exaggerated, Shermans weren't significantly more prone to catching fire than other tanks. The perception shaped how men fought and how they felt going into battle. When you believe your tank is a death trap, courage becomes a much heavier burden to carry. The Army had tried to address the problem. In January 1944, the first M4 Shermans mounting the improved 76mm M1 gun rolled off production lines. These tanks arrived in Britain on April 10, 1944, 130 of them, delivered in plenty of time for the Normandy invasion. They represented a significant upgrade in firepower, a gun that should have been able to handle German armor more effectively. Yet despite their availability, American commanders made a decision that would haunt them. They refused to deploy these improved tanks on D-Day. The reasons seemed sensible at the time. Crews hadn't had adequate time to train on the new weapon system. Logistics officers worried about maintaining two different types of ammunition, complicating an already complex supply situation. Most critically, commanders believed, wrongly as it turned out, that the 75mm gun would prove adequate for the opposition they expected to face. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. By early July 1944, as American forces struggled through the nightmare terrain of Normandy's hedgerows, the complaints about the 75mm gun's ineffectiveness reached the highest levels. On July 2nd, these concerns landed on General Dwight Eisenhower's desk. His response, witnessed and recorded by those present, captured the command-level frustration perfectly. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." According to those who were there, Eisenhower's language grew considerably stronger as he expressed his anger that ordnance had assured him the 76mm would handle anything the Germans could field. The reality was more complicated and more disappointing. By mid-July 1944, a series of evaluations by U.S. Army Ordnance and field commands confirmed that standard American tank guns were ineffective against the Panthers' frontal armor. Standard American tank weapons could not defeat Panthers frontally. General Omar Bradley immediately ordered the 76mm Shermans rushed from Britain to the front lines. On July 25th, during Operation Cobra, 102 M4A176 tanks made their combat debut. The initial reports were sobering. While the 76mm gun represented a real improvement over the 75, it still struggled against Panther frontal armor at anything beyond close range. Using standard M62 armor-piercing capped rounds, the 76mm could penetrate 109 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, enough to handle the Panzer IV and most German assault guns, but the Panther's sloped frontal armor remained effectively immune. The 76mm gun could penetrate the Panther's mantlet at very close ranges, generally within a few hundred meters, but such engagements were extremely risky. And at that distance, engaging a Panther was nearly suicidal. One tank commander reportedly put it bluntly to his crew. "We quickly realized the 76 still wasn't enough. You had to get on their flank, or you had to get close. Too close for comfort, too close to survive if you missed." The problem wasn't really the gun itself, it was the ammunition it fired. The solution lay in the intersection of metallurgy and physics, in understanding how materials behave under extreme stress and how to concentrate kinetic energy into the smallest possible point. By July 1944, American ordnance engineers had developed something remarkable: the T4 round, which would be standardized as the M93 HVAP high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. It represented a fundamental departure from conventional armor-piercing design. The projectile consisted of a tungsten carbide core surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and ballistic windshield. The genius of the design was in how it worked. The hard, dense tungsten core would do the actual penetrating, while the lightweight aluminum body reduced the overall weight of the projectile. Less weight meant higher velocity. Higher velocity meant more kinetic energy delivered to the target, and more energy concentrated into that small, incredibly hard tungsten point meant penetration where standard shells would fail. The results were dramatic. The M93 round achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second, compared to 792 meters per second for the standard M62 round. That 244 meter per second increase in velocity translated directly into penetrating power. In War Department-style test tables, the exact penetration depends on the test method and impact angle, but the key point is clear. M93 HVAP left the muzzle at about 1,036 meters per second, and it penetrated far better than the standard M62 round at typical combat ranges. The Panthers gun mantlet, which is commonly described as about 100 millimeters thick in a rounded casting, and because of its shape it could still present vulnerable areas under certain angles and ranges, suddenly became a viable target. Sherman crews who had been forced to attempt desperate flanking attacks or simply retreat could now engage Panthers at ranges up to 1,000 meters and have a reasonable chance of achieving a killing shot. The mantlet, a necessary weak point in the Panthers' otherwise formidable armor, became an Achilles heel. But developing the ammunition was only half the battle. Actually producing it in meaningful quantities was another challenge entirely. The T4 round depended on tungsten carbide, and tungsten was what military planners call a strategic material, meaning it's rare, difficult to obtain, and absolutely critical to the war effort. Before the war, China was widely seen as the leading tungsten producer, supplying roughly a third of global output, and the United States depended heavily on imports for many tungsten needs, and the United States depended heavily on these imports. But tungsten wasn't just needed for armor-piercing ammunition. Machine tools required tungsten carbide cutting edges. Armor plate production used tungsten to create harder steel. Various industrial processes across the war economy competed for the limited supply. Each 76mm HVAP round used a substantial tungsten carbide core, and even though that core was only part of the projectile, the total demand added up fast when you scaled it across tanks, tank destroyers, and multiple calibers. That might not sound like much, but when you start multiplying, every Sherman needed multiple rounds, every tank destroyer needed them, multiple calibers of HVAP were being produced. The numbers added up frighteningly fast. The United States supplemented Chinese imports with domestic production from limited deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but total availability remained constrained, no matter how desperately it was needed. Germany's tungsten situation was even worse. With Swedish imports, Germany's tungsten situation was even worse, because after 1941 it became much harder to reach traditional overseas sources, and Iberian wolfram from Spain and Portugal became one of the few practical channels Germany could still tap, even as Allied pressure tightened. By 1945, German factories were desperately hoarding what little tungsten they had for machine tools needed to produce aircraft engines, leaving Panther crews with only standard ammunition, while their American opponents were slowly gaining access to something far more deadly. The United States Ordnance Department had been testing HVAP projectiles since the spring of 1942, but production at scale didn't begin until after the Normandy landings revealed just how serious the Panther problem really was. The production numbers tell the story of an industrial system straining to meet a critical need. Early shipments were small and often rushed by air, and later deliveries came more steadily by sea, but the monthly totals in the European theatre still stayed far below demand through late 1944 and into early 1945. These numbers represented a significant industrial effort, thousands of workers in American factories producing these specialized rounds, precious tungsten being carefully allocated and processed. But it was still a fraction of what was actually needed in the field. By February 1945, 8 months after D-Day, the average 76mm Sherman in Europe had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds. 5 rounds to face an enemy that was deploying Panthers as the standard tank in Panzer divisions. A Sherman company with 17 tanks would possess 85 HVAP rounds total, while potentially facing German units fielding 30 or more Panthers. An ordnance officer, briefing tank crews on the new ammunition, reportedly put it bluntly. "We're asking you to fight Panthers with 5 rounds. Make every shot count, because you won't get more." For the men who would have to fight with this limitation, those 5 rounds represented both hope and frustration. Hope that they finally had a tool that could penetrate Panther armor from the front. Frustration that there would never be enough of it. The first widespread combat test of HVAP ammunition came not in Normandy's hedgerows, but in the open country of Lorraine, where American armored units had broken into terrain that favored maneuver but also suited German defensive doctrine. In September 1944, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army was racing toward the German border with supply lines stretched thin. The 4th Armored Division had seized a bridgehead over the Moselle River near Arracourt, creating a direct threat to Germany's industrial heartland. The German High Command reacted quickly. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was ordered to counterattack and destroy the American bridgehead. 2 newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, were committed, equipped mainly with factory-new Panther tanks, crewed by soldiers with limited training. On paper, the advantage seemed decisive. Across the Arracourt fighting, German forces brought in hundreds of tanks and assault guns, while Combat Command A operated with a smaller number of Shermans and tank destroyers, and the battles unfolded in a series of attacks rather than one simple head-to-head match. German planners believed the Panthers' superior armor and gun would ensure victory. They were about to learn that war does not follow simple math. The Battle of Arracourt, fought from September 18th to 29th, became the largest American tank engagement since North Africa. More importantly, it proved that American crews, using sound tactics and limited quantities of HVAP ammunition, could defeat technically superior German armor. On the morning of September 19th, thick haze reduced visibility to under 100 meters. German reconnaissance was ineffective, and Panther units advanced in column formation, a serious tactical mistake. American forces, already dug in, waited. Captain Kenneth R. Lameson's C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, held key approaches. His Sherman crews had been briefed to use HVAP carefully, aiming at Panther mantlets or turrets at close range. Every round mattered. Some after-action accounts describe Panthers appearing at very close range in the fog, and when HVAP was available and the hit landed in a vulnerable area, a Sherman crew could score a sudden kill, but the details varied from crew to crew and from one clash to the next. Prisoner interrogations later revealed German crews were shocked. They had been told Shermans could not penetrate Panther armor from the front. As the morning continued, similar actions unfolded across the sector. American tanks and M18 Hellcat tank destroyers engaged at close range, using terrain and concealment. By midday, artillery and P-47 fighter bombers joined the fight, breaking German attacks. HVAP did not make the Sherman equal to the Panther on paper. But combat is not decided by specifications alone. Coordination, training, and exploitation of weak points, mantlets, side armor, and crew confidence decided the outcome. By September 29th, German attacks had collapsed. American forces destroyed or disabled roughly 86 German armored vehicles. By the end of the fighting, US losses are often summarized as about 40 medium tanks and several tank destroyers, while German armored losses were far heavier. The 113th Panzer Brigade was reduced to fewer than 20 operational vehicles. At Arracourt, Panther crews learned a critical lesson. Their armor was no longer invulnerable, and the balance of the war was shifting. The Battle of Arracourt represented more than just a tactical victory. Marked what many American crews later experienced as a psychological turning point in the armored war in Europe. American tank crews learned they could defeat Panthers without waiting for specialized tank destroyers or overwhelming air support. They learned that with the right ammunition, even in desperately limited quantities, and proper tactics, the Panther was mortal. Years later, some American tankers described the morale shift in simple terms, because when HVAP was available and a hit landed in a vulnerable spot, they finally felt they had a real chance against a Panther. We couldn't believe it. These were the tanks that had been killing us for months, that we'd learned to fear and respect. Suddenly we had a way to fight back. It didn't make us equals. They still had better armor, better guns, but it gave us a chance, and a chance was all we needed. German crews lost something equally important, the psychological security that came from believing in their armor's invulnerability. When you know the enemy can hurt you, you fight differently. You're more cautious, slower to take risks, quicker to pull back when the tactical situation looks uncertain. That caution, multiplied across hundreds of tank crews, affected operational outcomes in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. In many accounts of Arracourt, the German defeat looks surprising on paper, because Panthers had strong armor and a powerful gun, yet the battle still went against them in fog, confusion, and close-range fights. The technical superiority of the Panther was undeniable on paper. Better armor, better gun, better optical equipment. How had these advantages been overcome so comprehensively? The answers lay partly in training and experience. The Panzer Brigade crews had minimal preparation, many arriving at the front with only weeks of instruction on their new tanks. American tank crews in the 4th Armored Division were veterans who had fought across France, who understood combined arms warfare instinctively, who had learned to read terrain for tactical advantage through months of hard combat. But training alone didn't fully explain the Panther losses, particularly the penetrations that shouldn't have been possible with standard American ammunition. German crews and repair teams could often tell when a sub-caliber round was involved, because the damage pattern could look different from standard shots, and over time, both sides learned that tungsten-cored ammunition existed, even if it was never common. The Americans had deployed tungsten-cored ammunition. This discovery had profound strategic implications. Germany had already fielded tungsten-cored ammunition, such as Panzergranate 40, but it was tied to limited tungsten supplies, and it could not be issued in large numbers forever, which used tungsten cores to improve penetration. By late 1944, Germany's tungsten supply was under severe pressure, and because wolfram imports from Portugal and Spain were restricted and contested, leaders had to prioritize machine tools and key production over specialized ammunition. If Americans could field specialized tungsten-cored ammunition in quantities sufficient to distribute to frontline tank units, it demonstrated an industrial capacity and resource access that Germany simply could not match. The realization was bitter. Not only were American tanks more numerous and better supported logistically, not only did American forces enjoy complete air superiority and vastly superior artillery support, but now they were equipped with ammunition that partially negated Germany's carefully engineered technical advantages in armor protection. The impact of HVAP ammunition extended well beyond the immediate tactical results at Arracourt. As word spread through American armored units, that the new ammunition could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances. HVAP stayed scarce, and some reports show units had only a few rounds per 76mm gun, but even that limited supply could boost confidence because crews believed they had at least one tool that might work in a crisis. The psychological paralysis that had affected some units during the difficult Normandy fighting began to dissipate, replaced by a more aggressive tactical mindset. Crews still respected the Panthers' capabilities. They weren't foolish enough to think HVAP made them invincible, but they no longer felt helpless. This shift in morale proved crucial for subsequent operations. A crew that believes it can fight will engage aggressively, will seek advantageous positions, will take calculated risks when opportunities appear. A crew that believes it's outmatched will hesitate, will cede initiative to the enemy, will look for reasons to avoid engagement. HVAP ammunition, though in critically short supply, provided American tankers with a weapon that allowed them to fight Panthers on more equal terms. Interestingly, even crews that had never actually fired an HVAP round benefited psychologically from simply knowing the ammunition existed and might be available when most desperately needed. But the scarcity created serious operational problems. Commanders at multiple levels, from battalion up to army, were forced to make difficult prioritization decisions with the limited HVAP supply. Tank destroyers, whose specific mission focused on engaging enemy armor, received preferential allocation. Sherman tanks, with their dual role of supporting infantry and engaging enemy armor, often received fewer rounds despite encountering enemy tanks just as frequently, if not more so. This allocation system, managed at multiple command levels, inevitably resulted in inefficiencies. Some units received more HVAP than they could immediately use, rounds sitting in ammunition dumps while other units exhausted their supply within days of heavy fighting and received no resupply despite urgent requests. The system worked reasonably well given the constraints, but it was never adequate to the actual tactical need. When German forces launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, American tank units faced renewed, intense pressure. Hundreds of Panthers and Tiger tanks deployed in winter conditions that favored defensive fighting and limited Allied air superiority due to poor weather. When HVAP was available, American crews valued it highly against Panthers and Tigers, but the supply stayed thin, so they still had to rely on combined arms, close-range tactics, and artillery support. The shortage became critical within days. Some units exhausted their entire HVAP supply and found resupply requests going unfulfilled as logistical networks struggled to deliver ammunition through snow-blocked roads disrupted by German advances. Tank commanders had to make agonizing decisions about when to use their remaining HVAP rounds, save them for a critical engagement that might never come, or use them now against targets that might be handled through other means. One tank commander later recalled the dilemma. "We had 3 HVAP rounds left in the entire platoon. 3 rounds, 5 tanks, and German armor all around us. Do you use them on the first Panther you see, or do you wait, hope you can avoid that one and save the rounds for a situation where you absolutely have no choice but to fight?" Those decisions aged us faster than the combat itself. Yet even in the difficult fighting of the Ardennes, American forces demonstrated that tactical skill and combined arms coordination could compensate for technical disadvantage. Tank crews coordinated closely with infantry, using bazooka teams to disable Panthers from close range, while Shermans provided covering fire. Forward observers could call time-on-target missions, and while artillery did not always punch through tank armor, it could still disrupt crews, damage exposed equipment, and sometimes immobilize vehicles through tracks and running gear. Air support, when the weather finally cleared around December 23rd and 24th, allowing Allied aircraft to return in force, proved devastatingly effective against German armor concentrated on approach roads. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could no longer contest Allied air superiority. German tanks learned to move only at night or in poor weather, ceding the daylight hours to an enemy who could call down destruction from above with terrifying efficiency. The Battle of the Bulge ended with German armored forces shattered, having lost hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and experienced crews in an offensive that failed to reach any of its strategic objectives. American armor had held, had fought, and had won, not because their tanks were better, but because their system of warfare was superior. The technical limitations of HVAP ammunition, while less publicized than its successes, deserve honest examination. The tungsten carbide core, while excellent at penetrating armor when conditions were favorable, was inherently brittle. At lower impact velocities, often cited in the range of roughly 2,300 to 2,500 feet per second, depending on conditions, the tungsten core was more likely to shatter on hardened armor instead of penetrating effectively. This meant that HVAP effectiveness declined significantly at longer ranges where velocity had decreased. HVAP rounds were most effective against the Panthers' gun mantlet at close to medium ranges. Beyond this distance, the probability of the core shattering on impact increased substantially, turning what should have been a penetrating hit into a disappointing failure. American tankers learned these limitations through combat experience, sometimes tragically. Crews that fired HVAP at Panthers beyond effective range wasted scarce ammunition and often provoked return fire from German guns that remained effective at much longer ranges. Training on proper HVAP employment was often minimal, as the ammunition arrived at frontline units faster than training materials could be developed and distributed. Many crews learned effective employment techniques through trial and error under actual combat conditions, paying for their education in blood and burned-out tanks. One sergeant's experience, documented in November 1944, illustrated both the potential and the limitations of HVAP in actual combat. His Sherman, equipped with a 76mm gun and carrying several HVAP rounds, engaged a Panther at approximately 800 yards. According to his after-action report, his gunner fired multiple rounds with several hits observed on the Panther's side armor, yet the rounds failed to achieve penetration, apparently striking at too oblique an angle or having lost too much velocity at that range. The sergeant later admitted his frustration. "We learned the hard way that these tungsten rounds weren't magic. Fire at the wrong range or wrong angle, and you'd just wasted a round you couldn't replace. The Panther ended up withdrawing, so I guess we won that engagement in a way. But it taught us that HVAP had limits, same as everything else. The engagement demonstrated that even HVAP required proper tactics, careful shot placement, accurate range estimation, and advantageous angles of engagement. It gave American tankers significantly better odds than standard ammunition, but success still demanded skill, judgment, and often a measure of luck. Post-war analysis of HVAP ammunition revealed a clear pattern. Against the Panther's gun mantlet at ranges up to 1,000 meters, HVAP was highly effective when hits were achieved, reliably penetrating and often causing catastrophic secondary explosions as ready ammunition detonated. Against the glacis plate, that heavily sloped frontal armor, results were generally poor except at very close ranges and nearly perfect angles of impact. The extreme slope meant that even tungsten-cored rounds traveling at high velocity would often ricochet or shatter. This meant Sherman crews still needed to maneuver for advantageous shot angles, still needed to flank Panthers when tactically possible. The ammunition didn't make Sherman tanks technical equals to Panthers, but it gave American crews a fighting chance in engagements where previously they'd had little hope of achieving frontal penetration. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided another combat test of HVAP effectiveness under very different circumstances. American Sherman tanks, now primarily the M4A3E8 variant, the improved Easy 8 model with better suspension, and the 76mm gun, faced Soviet-built T-34/85 tanks in North Korean and later Chinese service. Unlike the situation in Europe, where HVAP had been critically scarce, by 1950, tungsten supplies were less constrained than they had been during World War II, allowing HVAP ammunition to be issued more freely to frontline units. Substantial stocks of HVAP ammunition were readily available, and tank crews could employ it freely without the agonizing ammunition discipline that had characterized European combat. American tank crews in Korea found that HVAP rounds easily penetrated T-34/85 armor at normal combat ranges. The T-34/85, while a capable tank that had served the Soviets well against German armor, possessed armor protection significantly inferior to the Panthers. Although the T-34/85 had a turret front around 90 mm thick and a 45 mm glacis plate sloped at a steep angle, this level of protection was insufficient against 76mm HVAP rounds at normal combat ranges. American Shermans in Korea achieved remarkably favorable exchange ratios against communist armor. These favorable results were influenced by several factors, including better crew training, effective tactics, and the wider availability of HVAP ammunition. The weapon system that had been so scarce in Europe proved devastatingly effective when supply constraints no longer limited its employment. The vindication was bittersweet for veterans of the European campaign. The ammunition that could have been more widely employed against Panthers proved overwhelmingly effective in Asia, when industrial capacity was no longer divided among so many competing demands. One veteran, reflecting on Korea years later, observed, "We had in Korea what we needed in France, enough ammunition to fight the way we wanted to fight. It made all the difference in the world." The German view of American HVAP ammunition, based on post-war interrogations and captured documents, showed a mix of professional respect and deep frustration. German ordnance officers understood that American industry had solved the problem of tungsten-cored ammunition more effectively. Germany had fielded tungsten-cored ammunition early in the war, but it could not sustain large-scale use once tungsten became scarce. Germany fielded Panzergranate 40, an AP shot with a tungsten carbide core, but the supply of wolfram metal placed hard limits on how many could be issued. American HVAP production also faced tungsten shortages, but by late 1944, the US was increasing output and deliveries, while Germany's tungsten situation was tightening under heavy pressure. German tank crews often mentioned improved American ammunition as a factor that changed their tactics. Once Sherman tanks could penetrate Panther mantlets at combat ranges, German crews could no longer rely on frontal armor alone. This forced slower movement, greater caution, and heavier reliance on defensive positions, which reduced initiative and allowed American forces to apply combined arms tactics more effectively. The loss of armor invulnerability had a strong psychological effect. When the armor you trust may no longer protect you, combat becomes a different kind of experience, marked by hesitation and doubt. German engineers studied HVAP rounds recovered from wrecked tanks and clearly understood their design advantages. A dense tungsten core inside a lightweight aluminum body allowed high velocity, efficient use of scarce materials, and excellent energy retention at range. However, Germany lacked the industrial capacity and resources to respond. By late 1944, factories focused on sustaining existing production under constant air attack rather than developing new ammunition types. The Battle of Arracourt showed that American armored doctrine, mobility, logistics, and combined arms could defeat German methods that relied on superior individual tanks. German planners had assumed Panther firepower and armor would compensate for inexperienced crews, but this proved false. HVAP also mattered at the human level. For American tankers, it offered hope and confidence after the hard fighting in Normandy. German veterans such as Otto Carius later wrote that once armor no longer felt secure, crew morale and aggression declined. Panther crews facing HVAP-armed Shermans became more cautious, slower, and less willing to take risks. In the end, HVAP highlighted a broader truth of modern warfare. Both sides understood the technology, but only one side could produce it in meaningful numbers. Industrial capacity, not technical brilliance alone, decided the outcome. The post-war careers of veterans who fought at Arracourt reflect the enduring impact of these combat experiences on American military thinking. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion at Arracourt with distinction, rose through the ranks to become United States Army Chief of Staff. The lessons Abrams learned about combined arms warfare, the critical importance of crew training, and the necessity of adequate ammunition influenced his entire career and the doctrine he helped develop. The M1 Abrams entered U.S. Army service in 1980 with a 105mm rifled gun, and the later M1A1 variant, introduced in the mid-1980s, adopted a 120mm smoothbore gun and more advanced ammunition and sophisticated ammunition types, including depleted uranium penetrators that serve functionally the same role HVAP served in World War II, concentrating maximum kinetic energy into a dense, hard penetrator capable of defeating enemy armor. German veterans of Panther units who survived the war and later joined the West German Bundeswehr brought different but equally important lessons. They had personally experienced the limitations of possessing technological superiority without the industrial base and logistics to support it. Bundeswehr armor doctrine during the Cold War emphasized quality and training while explicitly recognizing that West Germany could not match Soviet numerical superiority. But Bundeswehr planners, informed by wartime experience, also emphasized ammunition effectiveness. Later West German tanks like the Leopard 1, which entered service in 1965 with a 105mm gun, reflected Cold War priorities where firepower, ammunition, and training mattered as much as armor, even if the direct lessons were shaped by many factors beyond World War II alone, perhaps more than armor thickness alone. The conclusion of World War II in Europe, marked by Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, ended the immediate tactical need for HVAP ammunition against Panthers. American ordnance officers systematically examining destroyed vehicles found clear evidence of HVAP penetrations on numerous wrecks, confirming the ammunition's effectiveness under favorable conditions while noting its limitations. Panthers hit by HVAP typically showed penetrations through the mantlet or turret face when struck at favorable angles, but rarely through the glacis plate, which remained highly resistant even to tungsten-cored ammunition. This pattern validated American tactical doctrine that emphasized flanking maneuvers and creating favorable engagement angles rather than relying on frontal slugging matches. The comprehensive post-war analysis concluded that while HVAP meaningfully improved Sherman capabilities against heavy German armor, the truly decisive factors remained overwhelming numerical superiority, vastly better logistics, complete air superiority, superior artillery support, and more effective operational doctrine. HVAP was an important piece of the puzzle, but only one piece among many. The transformation of American tank crews from mid-1944 to early 1945 reflected the cumulative impact of combat experience, improved equipment availability, and familiarity with specialized ammunition, including HVAP. Crews that landed in Normandy in June 1944 often felt genuinely apprehensive about facing German armor, particularly Panthers and Tigers. By early 1945, after months of sustained combat, significant training improvements, increased availability of 76mm Shermans, and growing familiarity with HVAP ammunition, American tankers approached engagements far more confidently. This psychological shift had direct tactical consequences. Confident crews fought more aggressively, took calculated risks when opportunities appeared, exploited tactical advantages rather than letting them slip away. While HVAP ammunition alone didn't create this transformation, its availability and proven effectiveness contributed meaningfully to improved American armored force morale and tactical performance. The legacy of HVAP development continues influencing modern ammunition design in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the engineers working in 1944. Current American armor doctrine consistently emphasizes ammunition effectiveness as a critical component of tank design. Modern tank ammunition employs depleted uranium or tungsten alloy penetrators, materials chosen for essentially the same density and hardness properties that made tungsten carbide effective 80 years ago. The underlying principle remains constant. Concentrate maximum kinetic energy into a small, extremely dense projectile, moving at the highest achievable velocity. The continuity from 1944 HVAP to present-day armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot ammunition illustrates how foundational lessons from World War II continued directly influencing military technology. Soviet and later Russian tank ammunition development followed remarkably similar paths, independently recognizing that armor-piercing capability depends heavily on projectile material properties and kinetic energy delivery. The global tank ammunition industry traces its technological roots directly back to the HVAP experience, where engineers first demonstrated conclusively that specialized ammunition could partially overcome armor protection advantages. On September 19, 1944, during the fighting around Arracourt, American Sherman crews used HVAP ammunition against Panthers in significant numbers, and these engagements contributed to a noticeable shift in confidence among U.S. armored units. German crews who had fought confidently behind their armor learned that American tanks could pose a serious frontal threat under the right circumstances. American crews who had felt outmatched gained meaningful confidence from knowing they possessed ammunition that could defeat Panthers when employed intelligently. This shift in tactical psychology, enabled by tungsten-cored ammunition produced in American factories and distributed, however inadequately, to frontline units, this shift in tactical psychology influenced many later armored engagements in the European theater, particularly those involving U.S. units equipped with 76mm Shermans. HVAP ammunition, though never available in desired quantities, provided enough improved capability to transform American tank crews from uncertain defenders into confident attackers willing to engage German armor directly. The crews who fired those first HVAP rounds in combat, watching tungsten cores punch through armor that had seemed invincible, demonstrated something profound about modern warfare. Industrial capacity and material science, applied intelligently to urgent tactical problems, could overcome seemingly insurmountable technical disadvantages. Superior equipment mattered, but superior systems of production, of logistics, of combined arms coordination, of training, mattered more. A veteran tanker, reflecting on his experiences decades after the war, perhaps said it best: "Those tungsten rounds didn't make our Shermans better than Panthers. The Panther was still the better tank. Better armor, better gun, better everything if you're just comparing specifications. But the HVAP rounds made us believe we could fight them. And that belief, that confidence, made all the difference. We stopped being afraid and started being dangerous. That's what won the war, not perfect weapons, but good enough weapons in the hands of men who believed they could win." That fundamental lesson, learned at considerable cost on the battlefields of France and Germany, remains directly relevant for anyone thinking about the technological challenges of modern warfare. Victory doesn't always go to the side with the best equipment. Sometimes it goes to the side that can produce adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities, deploy it effectively, and convince the men using it that they can win. If you enjoy history told more slowly and in greater depth, with a focus on the people behind the events, please like this video, subscribe to Beyond History, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories that come next, those quieter moments that often shaped the war and the lives within it.